this is Jen, and I make useful English lit study videos on Shakespeare, poetry, fiction, literary devices, and more to help you get top grades in the subject. Theory. Big, scary word, naff word, thorny word that's become pretty much shorthand for too much abstract matter and not enough practical relevance. But the thing is, theory is important because theory is often what underpins practice. And if you're studying literature, and especially at a higher level, then you're bound to come across literary theory at some point in your studies. So it's important that we at least understand what it is. And in fact, the ability to engage meaningfully with literary theory in textual analysis is usually a good indication of a top grade literature student. Even if you're studying lit at a GCSE level and you don't really intend to do literature at A-level, IB, or even university, it can still be really helpful and intellectually stimulating for you to understand what literary theory is and also potentially apply it to your own interpretation of texts. Because if you're able to do that, then you are most certainly going to gain an edge over the others. So the reason why literary theory gets a bad rep among students is that it's often overcomplicated by certain academics. And because it's usually written in this sort of complex, convoluted language, and often unnecessarily so. So that's why students tend to be put off by the density of the language, and this can often be a real shame. This video then, what I'll try to do is to break it all down for you so that by the end of this video, you will know exactly what literary theory means, what examples of literary theory there are, and how you can use literary theory in a way that helps you level up your analytical and reading skills. So let's jump straight into it. Literary theory is this woolly term, so let's just break it down step by step. It is a framework for readers like ourselves to deepen our understanding of a text. This framework is rooted in a particular way of looking at the world, and often it carries a set of assumptions about how and where meaning is created. Here's an example for you. A Marxist critical framework would assume that capitalist societies necessarily exploit the working class. And so when a Marxist critic is looking for a text's meaning, he or she will be looking at how the text and its characters convey messages about something like class struggle. A formalist framework, and when I say formalist, I mean essentially close reading framework, which is what all of you would know if you study literature. It's basically just looking at a text based on its use of literary or formal structural devices. And so a formalist framework would assume that people all over the world, regardless of their background and beliefs, can appreciate writing as a work of verbal artistry. And it's a universal ability, common to all. With this assumption, a formalist literary critic would seek out a text's meaning from purely textual elements like stylistic devices, metaphors, similes, personification, whatever, or poetic form. Say, for example, looking at how the sonnet conveys ideas related to unreciprocated love. So sometimes critics use a theoretical framework to convey and advance a specific social, cultural, or political agenda that can be unrelated to the literary text itself. And that's often when things become tricky and literary analysis kind of moves beyond the scope of literature and more into the fields of cultural, sociological, or even political criticism. So here's the TLDR version of what literary theory is. Literary theory is a framework that deepens our understanding of a text by having us apply specific assumptions about the world to our interpretative process. So here's the million-dollar question. Why does literary theory matter? Why can't we just read a poem or a book and say whatever we want to say about it? So at the most basic level, literary theory matters because it encourages us to engage with the text from a variety of perspectives that we would otherwise not consider. The same poem could yield radically different interpretations if we were to read it from a historicist, feminist, or queer perspective. So a good example of this would be Carol Ann Duffy's poem Anne Hathaway, which is named after Shakespeare's wife. If we were to read this poem from a historicist angle, then it could be a reappropriated account of the sort of emotional neglect that Shakespeare's wife had received. On the other hand, if we were to read it from a feminist angle, then it could be an imagined vindication of a spurned wife turned victorious widow who gets the last laugh. And if we were to read it from a queer perspective, then the poem could be read as this posthumous expose about a husband's possible homoerotic affairs. And you have to read the poem and find the line about how the guests in the other room get the best bed, and think about also the sonnet form being associated with Shakespeare's patron, the Earl of Wriothesley, to understand this. So I'd encourage you to go and look at that poem yourself and consider how you can apply historicist, feminist, and queer critical approaches to reading it. But the thing is, none of these interpretations are definitive. And that's exactly the point. By allowing ourselves to consider a single text from these different theoretical angles, we are the ones who make the text a much more interesting piece of writing, all the while becoming better, more critical, and more sensitive readers ourselves. So the problem with literary theory, as I mentioned earlier, arises when certain scholars use it to advance their political or cultural agendas. So some of these scholars take their theorizing to such an extreme that their analysis ceases to be literary analysis, and it often kind of moves away from the text. These critics often do it for sensationalist reasons, which actually sometimes work to give them cultural publicity or even cement their standing as a public intellectual. But this should never be the literature student's approach, because our priority as good lit students should always be to engage with the literary work itself. Our focus should be on the primary text, i.e. the poem, the novel, the play, the passage, what have you, and specifically on what the text may be trying to convey about a specific theme or idea. And so the theoretical framework would only come in as an aid to enhance, deepen, and diversify our understanding of how the text's themes and ideas could be received by different groups of people at different points in history or in different communities and societies. By the way, guys, I'd massively appreciate it if you could hit the thumbs up button below, subscribe to my channel, and switch on that bell notification if you find this video helpful so far. This would really help me carry on making these useful English lit study videos so that you can get top grades in the subject and we can inspire more people to enjoy the study of literature. Now, there's this misconception that literary theory only really came into being with the rise of 60s counterculture, and that's the period when literary theorists became these academic rock stars. But in reality, literary theory has been around for as long as people have been writing and producing texts. So back in ancient Greece, you had Aristotle, who put forth the concept of poetics as mimesis, the idea that literary representation was about imitating life as best as possible. And in the medieval ages, much of literary theory was a form of scholasticism practiced by Christian monks and clerks. And these monks and clerks' priorities was to reconcile scriptural contradictions, specifically between the Old and the New Testament, which is why theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas proposed interpretative methods like typology, which was about reading the Old Testament as an allegory for the New Testament. So with the arrival of the Renaissance period, you had people like Sidney who argued for literature as the best means of inspiring virtue, which interestingly conflicts with Plato and Socrates' idea that poetry pollutes minds and corrupts souls. So Sidney's view of literature as a moralizing force would continue to influence 19th century English theoretical approaches championed by writers like George Eliot and also cultural critics and poets like Matthew Arnold. Alongside developments in the British Isles, in 19th century continental Europe, there was also a dominant impulse of reading literature from a philological angle. And philology is the study of linguistics, grammar, syntax, morphology, etymology, what have you. And it really wasn't until the early 20th century when formalism, i.e. the practice of close reading, which we're also familiar with today, really became the sort of conventional approach to literary interpretation. And this came with the adoption of new criticism in the US and practical criticism in Britain, which were basically just these catch-all terms for this formalist approach of close reading texts. But then, of course, you have those critics who felt that this sort of formalist approach was way too insular and removed from historical realities. And so that's why, at the same time, you also had literary critics adopting Marxist and Freudian approaches. And it wasn't until the 1960s counterculture era when the kind of philosophically dense literary theory came on the scene. Initially, this came from the influence of French scholars like Derrida and Foucault, who were people that posited that everything, text, author, language, what have you, is a social construct that changes based on power structures prevalent at a given point in time. And so they really felt that meaning was all relative, right? And that there was never a sort of stable meaning, and any kind of meaning there was that came out of text was all dependent on whoever had power in a specific society and environment. So this specific period is now broadly referred to as postmodernism. We had examples of specific postmodernist theories like structuralism, post-structuralism, and deconstructionism, etc. But this sort of postmodernism was far more popular in American academia than it ever was in British universities, because faculties in Britain largely retained practical criticism and Marxism as the dominant theoretical approaches. And with the waning of British imperialism and the emergence of great Commonwealth writers like Chinua Achebe, Salman Rushdie, Fiyaz Naipaul, etc., post-colonial theory also gained traction as a theoretical approach, at least since the 1980s. More recently, we've seen a rise of alternative theoretical approaches, which have also been influenced by socio-cultural movements. For example, environmental activism gave rise to eco-criticism. You have the Me Too and Pride movement really solidifying feminist and queer theory, and also perhaps Black Lives Matter giving rise to something like critical race theory, which can also be an interesting angle to look at texts, specifically those perhaps, even from way back written in the Civil War period in American literature. But here comes what I think is the most important part in this video, and that is what I think is the best way to look at literary theory as a student. Whatever literary theory we choose to explore or adopt, it's important to remember that theory is only there as a guiding framework for us to interpret a text from a specific angle. This angle is based on a set of socio-cultural, political, or artistic assumptions, which may speak strongly to our values, but not necessarily appeal to other groups of readers. So the core of our literary analysis then should always be informed by a close reading of the text, which anchors our focus to the writing itself and allows us to be attuned to the writer's linguistic intricacies and the work's artistic value, which should always be the most important thing. And it's only once we give the text the attention and respect that it deserves that we can apply literary theory to deepen our engagement with the text by placing it in a variety of broader contexts. And this is super helpful because it synergizes our own engagement with the text with the different perspectives of different critical angles. And it enables us to see how different groups of people could receive the same text differently. And that's it for this video, guys. I hope this has been a helpful primer for you to understand what literary theory actually is, what are some of the most important literary theories out there, and how we should be thinking about literary theory in a way that best helps us understand, read, appreciate, and analyze our texts. So let me know if you want to see more videos about the different types of literary theory, and perhaps I can do a deep dive series on how we can apply different theoretical approaches to reading texts. And if you enjoyed this video, please do hit the thumbs up button below so that you can help grow my channel, so that I can help you and other passionate students level up their study of literature. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already and switch on that bell notification so that you don't miss out on any top grade English Lit Study video from me down the line. And I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!